I followed Alexander across the world. I watched him destroy armies, burn cities, and turn terrified men into conquerors. I saw kings abandon their thrones at the sound of his approach. I saw men who had once feared crossing a river follow him beyond the edge of every map they knew. We spoke of him as if he were a god, and for a long time, I believed it. But India changed us. By then, we had been marching for years. Our armor was broken. Our sandals were worn through. The faces beside me were no longer the faces that had left Macedonia. Too many had been buried along the road. Still, Alexander wanted more. There was always another river to cross, another city to take, another enemy standing between him and the end of the world. Then came the day at the Mallian fortress. The ladders went up against the wall, and Alexander climbed first. Of course he did. But too many soldiers tried to follow him. The wood cracked. Men fell into the dust. And when I looked up, our king was standing alone on the battlement. Enemy arrows were cutting through the air around him. We shouted for him to come back. We begged him to wait. Alexander looked down at us. Then he turned toward the fortress. And he jumped. Not back toward his army, forward, alone, into a city filled with enemy soldiers. For one heartbeat, thousands of Macedonians forgot how to breathe. Then we understood. Alexander had not entered that fortress to save us. We would have to enter it to save him. That was the moment I finally understood the truth. Our king was not a god. He was not immortal. He was completely insane. My name is Menon, and I was there.
You will not find my name in the histories. Men like me rarely appear there. Historians remember kings, generals, men who changed the fate of nations. They do not usually remember the soldier standing 20 rows back, trying not to lose his footing. So understand something before I tell you this story. I am not Alexander. I did not know his plans. I did not sit inside his tent while generals moved armies across maps. Most days I knew only three things: where I was told to march, where I was told to stand, and which man beside me I was expected to keep alive. That was enough. I was a Macedonian infantryman. When Alexander crossed into Asia, I crossed with him. When he marched east, I marched east. And when he decided that the known world was not large enough for him, men like me discovered just how far one man's ambition could carry thousands of others. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand why we followed him into India, you have to understand what Alexander was like before we began to fear him. You have to understand why we loved him. Alexander became our king when he was barely 20 years old. 20! Think about that. Older generals had spent their entire lives preparing to command armies. Alexander inherited one before most men had decided what kind of man they wanted to become. There were enemies everywhere, outside Macedonia, inside Macedonia. Men who thought Philip's son would be easier to control than Philip himself. They learned quickly. Alexander moved before his enemies had time to decide what to do with him. Revolts were crushed. Rivals submitted. Greece was brought back into line. And then he turned toward Persia. Persia. The empire our parents had grown up fearing. An empire of enormous cities, ancient kings, and wealth beyond anything most Macedonians had ever seen. Alexander looked at it and decided it belonged to him. I was young enough to think that sounded magnificent. Most of us were. There was something about him. When Alexander spoke, the impossible stopped sounding impossible. You stopped thinking about all the reasons you might die. You began thinking about how extraordinary it would be if you survived. That was his gift. Not the sword, not the horse, not even the army his father had built. Alexander's greatest weapon was making ordinary men believe they were standing at the beginning of something the world would remember forever. And he was right. We simply had no idea what remembering it would cost. When we crossed into Asia, Persia still felt enormous. After the first victories, it began to feel mortal. At the Granicus, Alexander went toward the danger instead of away from it. That became a pattern. Whenever fighting became uncertain, whenever men hesitated, somehow Alexander appeared near the part of the battle where a king had no sensible reason to be. At first, I thought this was stupidity. Then we kept winning, so I decided it must be genius. That is one of the strange things about success. If a reckless man survives often enough, people stop calling him reckless. They call him brave. At Issus, we faced Darius himself, the great king of Persia, the man who commanded an empire larger than anything Macedonia had ever dreamed of possessing. And Darius fled. Try to imagine what that did to us. We had grown up hearing about Persian kings as if they belonged to another level of existence. Then one afternoon, their king ran from ours. After that, Alexander became something different in the minds of his soldiers. If he told us a wall could fall, we believed the wall would fall. If he told us a desert could be crossed, we crossed it. If he pointed toward an army twice our size, we checked our shields and waited for the signal. We were not fearless. Do not believe anyone who tells you good soldiers are fearless. Fear is useful. Fear keeps your shield up. Fear reminds you to listen. But Alexander did something more dangerous than removing fear. He made us ashamed of it. How could I admit I was frightened when my king was already riding toward the enemy? So we followed, and we won, again and again and again. Tyre resisted him, so Alexander found a way across the sea to reach it. Egypt welcomed him. At Gaugamela, Darius came again with another enormous army. Alexander broke that one too. Persia was ours. The palaces were ours. The treasure was ours. Darius was gone. The war we had crossed into Asia to fight was over. At least that is what many of us thought. I remember men beginning to speak about home. Not loudly, almost like saying the word might offend Alexander. Home, a farm, a vineyard, a mother who had become older while her son was away becoming famous. Children who barely remembered their fathers. Surely now we would return. But Alexander looked east. There was always east. Beyond Persia came mountains. Beyond the mountains, another enemy. Beyond that enemy, another province, another king, another people. Alexander had decided needed to learn who he was. We marched through places whose names I had never heard before we entered them. Bactria, Sogdiana. Mountain passes where the cold seemed determined to kill whatever the enemy had missed. Years passed. The army changed. The young men who had crossed the Hellespont were becoming veterans. Some carried scars. Some walked with pain. Some simply disappeared from the line after a battle, and another man stood in their place the next morning. My shield was repaired so many times that I could no longer remember which part of it was original. And Alexander? He changed too. How could he not? Everywhere we went, men bowed. Kings surrendered. Cities opened their gates. Priests called him chosen. Nobles competed for his attention. We had spent years proving to Alexander that he could accomplish impossible things. Eventually, I think Alexander began to believe there were no impossible things left. And perhaps that was partly our fault, because every time he asked for the impossible, we gave it to him. Then came India. Even after everything we had seen, India felt different. The air, the rain, the rivers, the distance, and the elephants. We had heard stories about them before we saw them. Soldiers always make an enemy larger while waiting to meet him. By the time those stories reached me, the elephants could supposedly crush 10 men beneath 1 foot and frighten a horse merely by breathing on it. Then I saw one. The stories no longer seemed ridiculous. At the Hydaspes River, King Porus waited for us on the opposite side. His army included war elephants positioned with his infantry. Our horses could see them, and our horses wanted nothing to do with them. The river itself was another enemy. Porus watched the obvious crossing points, so Alexander did what Alexander always did. He made the enemy look in one direction, while he moved in another. Under storm and darkness, part of the army crossed upstream. The rain helped conceal the movement. By the time Porus understood where Alexander had gone, Macedonian troops were already establishing themselves across the river. Then the armies met. I had fought Persians, Greeks, horsemen from the north, mountain tribes. Nothing prepared me for the sound of elephants moving toward infantry. You do not merely hear them. You feel them through the earth. Our formation tightened. Men shouted at each other to hold, to stay together, to remember their training. That is what a phalanx is when everything goes wrong. Not thousands of heroes, thousands of frightened men agreeing, for a few more seconds, not to run. We survived. That sounds simple when historians write it. We won. 2 words. They do not tell you how long those words can take. Eventually, Porus's army broke. The elephants tired. Our cavalry closed around the battlefield, and another king stood defeated before Alexander. But Porus was different. Alexander respected him. He asked Porus how he wished to be treated. The answer became famous, like a king. Alexander allowed him to continue ruling and entrusted him with even more territory. I remember hearing the story in camp. Most men admired it. So did I. This was the Alexander I still wanted to believe in. The king who recognized courage in an enemy. The king who could defeat a man and then honor him. But our victory at Hydaspes had shown us something else. India did not end at that river. There were more kingdoms ahead, more armies, more rivers, more elephants. And somewhere beyond all of them, Alexander imagined another horizon waiting for him. Then we reached the Hyphasis River. Alexander wanted to continue. Of course he did. Beyond the river, stories spoke of powerful peoples and enormous armies. Again, no one knew how much was true. That hardly mattered anymore. We had been away for years. The men were exhausted. Some had survived every major campaign since we entered Asia. Every victory had carried us farther from Macedonia. That was the cruel joke. Winning was supposed to bring us closer to home. With Alexander, winning only created another road. This time, something broke. Not a ladder, not a formation, the army itself. Alexander gathered his commanders. He reminded them of everything we had achieved, of everything that might still lie ahead. He spoke about glory, about completing what we had begun. There had been a time when words like those could move us anywhere, but not now. The men remained silent. Imagine that. Alexander had faced armies numbering in the tens of thousands. He had faced fortified cities and kings. Now he faced silence, and he could not defeat it. One of his commanders, Coenus, finally spoke for the army. The men had given enough. They wanted to return. Alexander was furious. He withdrew. For days he waited. Perhaps he expected us to feel ashamed. Perhaps he expected the old magic to return. It did not. The camp remained quiet, and eventually, Alexander announced that we would turn back. Men cried with relief. Men cheered. Some thanked the gods. But I remember looking toward Alexander's tent. For the first time since crossing into Asia, someone had told him no, and the world had not ended. We thought turning back meant going home. We were wrong. Alexander intended to move south, through the river system toward the ocean. There were still peoples along the route who did not accept his authority, and Alexander did not leave resistance behind him if he could crush it first. Among those peoples were the Mallians. They lived in the Punjab. They knew we were coming, and they were preparing to fight. Alexander learned that forces in the region might combine against him. So he moved quickly, very quickly. Speed had always been one of his greatest weapons. He could put an army somewhere before the enemy believed an army could arrive. To generals, that is brilliance. To the infantryman carrying his armor through the heat, it feels somewhat different. We marched. We drank when we could. We slept when we were allowed. And we kept moving. Settlements that resisted were attacked before their neighbors could support them. The defenders withdrew from one position to another until eventually we came to the place I would remember for the rest of my life. A Mallian stronghold, walls, a citadel, defenders who had nowhere else they intended to go. Men protecting their own land from an army that had marched thousands of miles to stand outside their homes. At 24, I had thought every enemy of Alexander was standing between us and glory. By 32, I understood that the man on the other side of my shield probably believed exactly the same thing about me. I remember one of them. I never knew his name. He was standing above us with a bow. He looked tired. So did I. For one strange moment, neither of us looked like a hero. We looked like two men who wished the other one had stayed home. The outer position fell quickly. The defenders withdrew into the citadel, and that should have slowed us down. A fortified position requires patience, ladders, coordination, men in the right place at the right time. But patience had never been Alexander's favorite weapon. Some of our troops were delayed, Not enough ladders had reached the citadel. Men began trying to break through. Others searched for places where the walls could be climbed. Alexander watched. Seconds passed, then more. The men carrying the scaling ladders were not moving quickly enough for him. So the king of Macedonia walked over, took a ladder from one of his own soldiers, placed it against the wall, raised his shield, and began climbing. I remember thinking, of course he did. That was Alexander. If an army moved too slowly, he became the army. Puchestus went after him. Leonidas followed. Another soldier, Abraeus, climbed nearby, and suddenly every Macedonian below understood the same thing. The king was on the wall. We had to reach him. Alexander reached the top. The defenders recognized what was happening. This was not another Macedonian soldier. This was him, the king, the man whose name had traveled ahead of us for years. Alexander fought for space on the battlement. Below him, we panicked. That is the only honest word for it. Everyone wanted to reach him. Men crowded onto the ladder. Another man climbed behind him, then another. The wood began to bend. Someone shouted for us to stop. Nobody listened. Then I heard it, a crack, a sound so small for something that changed everything. The ladder broke. Men fell backward into us. I hit the ground. Someone's shield landed beside my head. Dust filled my mouth. For several seconds, I did not know which direction I was facing. Then I heard Alexander's name. I pushed myself up and looked toward the wall. There he was, above us, isolated on the battlement. Defenders were throwing missiles from nearby positions. The men below began shouting, "Come back! Wait! We will reach you!" Some soldiers actually held out their arms toward him, as though Alexander could simply climb down into them. He looked at us. Even from below, I could see him making the decision. He could remain where he was, exposed on the wall. He could try to return toward the broken ladder, or he could go forward. I had followed this man for 8 years. I should have known which one he would choose. Alexander turned toward the inside of the fortress. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. His cloak moved behind him. He looked down, then he jumped. Forward, into the fortress, alone. I have tried for years to understand what passed through his mind. Perhaps he believed we would reach him immediately. Perhaps he thought standing still was more dangerous. Perhaps he saw another impossible situation and simply did what he had always done, attack it. But I know what passed through mine. Our king has lost his mind. The Mallian defenders must have been as shocked as we were. A king had just dropped into their fortress, not behind an army, ahead of it. Alexander placed himself where the wall could protect part of his back. The defenders closed around him. Puchestus reached him. Leonidas was there, Abraeus too, only a handful. Outside the wall, thousands of Macedonians were suddenly fighting for one purpose. Not the fortress, not glory, not conquest. Alexander. Men attacked the wall. Men searched desperately for another way up. Others pushed toward the gates. Everything we had been taught about order disappeared. We were no longer an army trying to capture a stronghold. We were men trying to rescue our king from our king. I climbed. Another soldier pushed beneath my foot. I grabbed a hand above me. Someone pulled. For a moment, I reached high enough to see inside. Alexander was still standing. Then an arrow struck him. He staggered and disappeared from my view. The sound that moved through our men was unlike anything I had heard in battle. Someone shouted that the king had fallen. Another shouted that he was dead. And suddenly, the entire future of the army was on the other side of that wall. Puchestus stood over him. Leonidas fought beside him. Alexander was on the ground. For years, I had seen that man larger than everyone around him. Now he looked human. That frightened me more than the enemy. More Macedonians reached the inside. Then more. The defenders were overwhelmed. I remember almost nothing clearly after that. Dust, shouting, men pushing toward the place where Alexander had fallen. Then I saw him being carried away. His eyes were closed, his armor damaged. No speech, no command, no impossible plan. Just the body of a man, carried by other men. And I thought, this is how the world ends. That night, we waited. No one knew how serious the wound was. Rumors moved through the camp. The arrow had gone too deep. The king could not breathe. The king was unconscious. The king was dying. Then came the worst rumor. Alexander was dead. I had spent years wishing the man would finally stop. Now the thought of him stopping terrified me. Because if Alexander was dead, what were we? We were thousands of miles from Macedonia, surrounded by peoples who had every reason to hate us. His generals were powerful men, but which one was king? Which one would the army obey? Would they fight each other? Would the lands behind us revolt? Would any of us ever see Macedonia again? Only then did I understand the trap we had built for ourselves. We complained that Alexander had become too powerful, yet we had made ourselves dependent on that power. We wanted freedom from his ambition, but we needed his authority to get us home. Then we saw him. Alexander came down the river where the army could see him. At first, I did not trust my own eyes. Then he raised his hand. The camp exploded. Men shouted, men cried, some prayed. Men who had cursed him days earlier pushed forward merely to see that he was breathing. When he was strong enough, Alexander showed himself more openly to the army. The message was simple: I am alive. And I remember looking at the men around me, the relief on their faces, the love, the devotion. My own eyes were wet, and that disturbed me. Because nothing had changed. Alexander had still jumped. He had nearly thrown away everything we had built, everything we had survived. And yet, seeing him alive felt like seeing the sun return. Alexander survived. Of course he did. Men like him always seem immortal until the moment they are not. And we followed him again. That is the part people may find difficult to understand. I knew what he was now. Brilliant, fearless, restless, dangerous. A man capable of making thousands believe that the impossible was merely waiting to be conquered. People would remember his jump as courage. Perhaps it was. But if an ordinary soldier had abandoned his position and jumped alone into that fortress, we would have called him a fool. Alexander did it, so history called him great. I fought beside Alexander. I admired him, I feared him, and yes, I would probably have followed him again. That was his true power, and that was what frightened me most.
That's the end of this video. Would you like to see more of it? I hope so. Let me know in the comments.